Welcome to Reformed Thinking. You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this sort of expectation of clinical precision.
Right. Yeah, like it's a math problem or something.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
You walk into a hospital, you get evaluated, and the whole process feels very much like engineering, like you fall off a ladder, right, and you break your arm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the doctor orders an X-ray, and a few minutes later, you are looking at a black and white image. The doctor points to that jagged white line on the screen and says, there is the fracture.
The visual evidence makes it undeniable. I mean,
Yeah.
the situation is basically binary. You have a broken bone or you do not have a broken bone.
Right.
And the treatment protocol is standard, the timeline for healing is established, and you leave the hospital knowing the precise mechanics of your recovery.
And that kind of clarity is incredibly comforting. I mean, we like our problems to be visible, don't we?
Oh, for sure. We want things to make sense.
Yeah, we like them to be categorized and placed into neat little boxes. But then you step out of the physical realm and into the world of human suffering or testing and moral temptation.
And that is a whole different ballgame.
It really is. Suddenly that X-ray machine is broken.
Yeah.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, quite honestly, murky.
Yeah. Very murky.
People are hurting. They are under massive unseen pressure, and they are desperately looking for a clean, simple answer. And in that desperation, our modern culture has generated this incredibly common, highly sanitized therapeutic cliche.
Oh, I know where you were going with this.
Yeah, you, the listener, have heard it a million times. People print it on coffee mugs.
Yeah.
They cross-stitch it onto decorative pillows. They post it on social media with a sunset background. They say, God won't give you more than you can handle.
Yeah, that phrase. It is ubiquitous in our culture. I mean, it is constantly offered as a life preserver to people who feel like they are just drowning in hardship.
But it's not actually helpful, is it?
No, not at all, because when we actually open the biblical text that this phrase supposedly comes from, we find something entirely different.
Right.
The true text does not flatter our natural human abilities. It does not promise a pain-free existence, and it certainly does not validate our fleshly independence.
So let's unpack this. For this specific deep dive, we've gathered a massive stack of sources.
A really big stack today.
Yeah. We are looking at historical records of first-century Roman colonies, linguistic studies focusing on ancient Greek military terminology, extensive theological commentaries on the original Greek text, and pastoral treatises.
Right, drawing heavily from the Reformed tradition.
Yeah. And our mission today is focused entirely on 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13.
Just one verse, but it carries immense theological gravity.
Huge gravity. But it constantly gets flattened out into this shallow, almost secular self-help slogan. So, to you, the listener, here's our objective today.
Lay it out for them.
We are going to strip away the cultural reading of this text.
Yes.
We're going to throw out the idea that this verse is just a quick, shallow pat on the back.
Yeah, we have to get rid of that.
Instead, we are going to replace that thin interpretation with a robust, God-centered understanding of divine providence and human testing.
Which is so much better than the cliche anyway.
It really is. We're going to see what the Apostle Paul was actually saying to a church that was living in a literal daily pressure cooker.
Yeah. And our core thesis for this discussion revolves around the unyielding decrees of the Creator. We are looking at how God monergistically governs every single trial.
Monergistically, that is a huge word.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, he is not a passive observer watching us struggle from a distance, just sort of hoping we figure it out.
Right. He isn't just cheering from the sidelines.
Not at all. He places strict, absolute limits on the intensity of the temptation, and at the exact same moment, he constructs a precise route of perseverance for his elect.
That is so comforting to hear.
Yeah, the text reveals a God who governs the intensity and duration of testing. A God who preserves his people without excusing their duty, and who strengthens them to endure rather than surrender.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But before we get into the heavy lifting of the theology and, the vocabulary of the text, we have to look at the people Paul was writing to.
The original context.
Right. We need to ground this theology in real human struggle. The original audience was dealing with intense external pressure, and if we miss that historical reality, we miss the weight of the promises.
Yeah, the historical grounding of this letter changes how we read every single chapter. I mean, the Apostle Paul wrote this letter around AD 55 to a young congregation in the city of Corinth.
And Corinth was not just a sleepy little village.
Oh, not at all. To grasp their situation, we really have to paint a vivid picture of this location. Corinth was not just any city. It was actually destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC,
Okay.
but it was rebuilt as a Roman colony by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. So by the time Paul arrives, it had grown into a remarkably wealthy, highly strategic commercial hub.
Because of where it was on the map, right?
Yeah. It sat right on the narrow isthmus joining northern and southern Greece, so it controlled major trade routes connecting the east and the west.
Like a massive shipping bottleneck.
Spot on. And because of this geography, it was full of transient merchants, Roman soldiers, Greek philosophers, sailors on shore leave, and ambitious families seeking rapid upward mobility.
It sounds like an ancient version of a bustling, hyper-competitive, modern metropolis. You know, like everyone is hustling for status, trying to make a name for themselves, and chasing wealth.
Yeah, the atmosphere was fiercely competitive, and it was deeply entrenched in pagan idolatry. The city was physically dominated by the Corinth.
The Corinth, what was that?
This was a massive, sheer mountain rising abruptly above the city limits. It just sort of loomed over everything.
Oh, wow.
And atop that mountain stood the sprawling temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The association with sexual immorality was so pervasive throughout the ancient world that the Greek phrase, to behave like a Corinthian, was actually a widespread euphemism.
A euphemism for what?
For engaging in gross licentiousness and prostitution.
Oh, wow. So just their city name became a slang term for gross sin.
Yeah, pretty much. And along with Aphrodite, the city was filled with temples to Apollo, Octavia, and the imperial cult demanding absolute allegiance to Caesar.
I want to bring this to life for you, the listener. It is so easy to look back at ancient history and think of these temples as just dusty stone buildings where people occasionally went for quiet religious services.
Right, like modern museums or something.
Yeah, but that was not the reality on the ground. The Corinthian church was operating as a local embassy in a highly hostile empire.
They were completely surrounded.
Yeah. If you think about the Old Covenant, the nation of Israel had distinct geographic borders. They had a civil structure, their own magistrates, and a physical separation from the surrounding nations.
They had a buffer zone.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The believers in Corinth had no such physical barriers. They were living right in the belly of the beast. Civic life, commercial life, and family life were all inextricably tied to these pagan temples.
The overlap between daily survival and pagan worship was absolute. It wasn't optional. I mean, if a guild of merchants wanted to celebrate a successful business quarter, they held a banquet.
And where was the banquet?
It was hosted in the dining room of a pagan temple.
Oh, man.
Yeah. If a family celebrated a wedding or a civic milestone, the meat served at the festival was first sacrificed to idols. These were not optional religious events, you know. They were the social and economic glue holding the entire city together.
Here is an analogy that might help us grasp the sheer weight of this environment. Imagine the Corinthian temple system, like modern corporate networking, combined with a digital social credit system.
Ooh, that is a good way to picture it.
Yeah, imagine if you simply could not function in society. You could not get a job, you could not buy groceries, you could not secure a contract for your business, and your own family would disown you unless you attended these massive corporate parties that explicitly required you to pledge allegiance to a rival god.
The pressure would be unbearable.
Right. If you decline the feast, you are facing severe social ostracism and immediate economic ruin. You lose your livelihood.
You lose everything, basically.
So, considering that intense societal demand, how does Paul dismantle the excuse that their situation was somehow an impossible, exceptional anomaly? Because I would look at that pressure, I would look at my starving family, and I would say, Paul, you don't understand. My situation is uniquely terrible. I have to compromise.
Right, because the human heart constantly seeks to excuse sin by claiming that our circumstances are unprecedented. We tell ourselves that no one understands our specific pressure.
We all do that.
We really do. We say that our weakness is exceptional, or that obedience in this particular instance is literally impossible.
But Paul doesn't buy that.
No, Paul answers that exact reasoning right at the beginning of the verse. He uses the Greek word parasmos, which can denote either an internal temptation to sin or an external providential test.
Yet in Corinth.
In this context, both dimensions are fiercely active. They are facing external social pressures from the culture and internal carnal desires from their own flesh.
And Paul uses a very specific verb tense to describe how this parasmos is affecting them. He did not treat it as a passing thought.
No, he doesn't. The verb translated has overtaken is ilephin. This tense describes an action that occurred in the past but has continuing, gripping, present consequences.
So it's still holding on to them.
Yes, temptation has seized them, it has laid hold of them, and refuses to let go. Paul is not minimizing the reality of their struggle here.
He's validating that it's hard.
He is acknowledging that the pressure is severe, it is ongoing, and it is exhausting. However, he immediately places a definitive boundary on it by calling the trial anthropinos.
Anthropinos, meaning human.
Yeah, human. It designates that which belongs to human nature or that which operates on a human scale. Paul is telling the Corinthians that their trials are not monstrous, superhuman, or cosmic anomalies.
They are standard.
Exactly. I mean, they are standard for a fallen human race. He restricts their experience to the common boundaries of ordinary humanity. He flatly denies the claim that they face an unprecedented moral situation where obedience has somehow become impossible.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? This strips away the lie of isolation.
The lie of isolation, that is a great way to put it.
Yeah, when you face intense pressure, whether it is a financial crisis, a chronic illness, a hostile work environment, or a crushing temptation to compromise your integrity, the enemy whispers a specific lie.
And it is a very convincing lie.
It is. The enemy tells you that your situation is a unique cosmic horror. The lie says that no one in the history of the church has ever faced the specific combination of stress, exhaustion, and desire that you are facing right now.
You are the only one going through this.
Right. And therefore, because your situation is so uniquely terrible, you are entirely justified in lowering your standards and giving in to the pressure. But Paul shatters that delusion. He calls the trial standard, it is a human-scale battle.
Yeah, and by declaring that no temptation has overtaken them except such as is common to man, Paul simultaneously humbles the proud believer and comforts the weak believer.
Oh, I love that. How does it humble the proud?
Well, the proud believer, who thinks they are above ordinary struggles, is brought down to reality. They are not special. And the weak believer realizes they are walking a path already trodden by a massive cloud of witnesses.
They aren't alone.
Right. The specific forms of the temptation may vary across centuries, obviously. A Roman temple feast looks different from a modern digital temptation, but the roots remain identical.
Which are what?
Those roots are disordered desire, the fear of man, the love of ease, the hunger for status, resentment, and idolatry. Recognizing that your trial is common does not trivialize your pain.
No, not at all.
Rather, it places your struggle firmly within the historical arena where God has repeatedly sustained his people.
That establishes such a vital foundation. We are dealing with human-scale testing. But knowing the external pagan pressure is really only half the story of what is happening in Corinth, right?
Yeah, there is a whole internal dynamic too.
Yeah. We also have to address the internal dynamics of the church, specifically the internal arrogance of the Corinthian elite. The danger was not just out there in the pagan temples. The danger was sitting in the pews right next to them.
Oh, absolutely. If we view this within the broader argument of Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians 10.13 cannot be read in isolation. It is embedded in a sustained logical progression spanning chapters 8 through 10.
What was the main issue in those chapters?
The central controversy in these chapters concerns the meat sacrificed to idols. There was a vocal faction in the Corinthian church that felt incredibly enlightened.
The intellectual elite.
Right. They had superior theological knowledge. They reasoned that since an idol represents a false god, and since there is only one true God, the idol is essentially nothing. It is just a piece of carved wood or stone.
Which is technically true.
It is technically true.
No.
But therefore, they felt totally free to attend pagan banquets, recline in the temple dining rooms, and just eat the sacrificial meat.
They were puffing themselves up with their own intellectual brilliance. They had the right theological premise. An idol is nothing, but they were misapplying that premise disastrously.
Disastrously. They believed that their sophisticated knowledge, combined with their participation in the Christian sacraments, specifically baptism and the Lord's Supper, made them entirely bulletproof against spiritual ruin.
Bulletproof. Wow.
Yeah, they thought they could casually wander through the idolatrous culture, absorbing the sights and sounds of pagan worship without any risk of spiritual contamination.
And Paul doesn't agree with that application.
Not at all. Paul agrees with their initial premise that idols are nothing. However, he vehemently denies that abstract theological knowledge settles every practical question of Christian living.
Right.
He warns them that their raw exercise of rights could destroy the consciences of weaker believers who were just rescued from that very idolatry.
And to really drive this point home, Paul uses the history of Israel as a massive typological warning. He holds up Israel's history like a mirror for the Corinthians to look into.
It is a brilliant rhetorical move.
It is. He points out that historical Israel had immense corporate privileges. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea during the Exodus. They ate spiritual food, the manna raining down from heaven every morning.
They drank spiritual drink from the rock.
Yes, they had the visible, tangible presence of God leading them through the desert. Yet despite all of those incredible external privileges, they fell to idolatry, sexual immorality, and grumbling. Their bodies were scattered across the wilderness. God was not pleased with them.
And the parallel Paul draws between Israel and Corinth is striking. The wilderness generation was delivered from the bondage of Egypt, just as the Corinthians were delivered from the bondage of pagan darkness.
Right, both delivered.
Yes. Yet Israel treated their covenant privileges as a guarantee of absolute safety while they engaged in blatant disobedience. Paul explicitly states that these wilderness events happened as examples and were written down for the instruction of the church.
So they wouldn't do it again?
Right, but the Corinthians were repeating the very same historical pattern. They were treating their baptism and their participation in communion as if it were a magical ward against the consequences of their flirtation with paganism.
I have to push back here on behalf of the listener because, well, it sounds like the Corinthians were treating grace and the sacraments like a magic shield.
Yeah, a magic shield is a great way to describe it.
But are modern believers making the same error today? Do we assume that our doctrinal correctness or our regular church attendance or our robust theological libraries somehow grant us immunity from falling into serious sin?
Oh, absolutely. The human tendency to rely on external religious markers is incredibly persistent. A modern believer might look at their life and think, I read the right books, I listen to the best expositional sermons, I attend a solid church every Sunday, I know my catechism, therefore I am safe.
For checking the boxes.
Yeah, checking the boxes. We can easily develop a carnal self-confidence that assumes our intellectual grasp of theology replaces the need for daily, vigilant mortification of sin.
Oh, that is so dangerous.
It is. We rely on our religious resume instead of walking independent humility. We think our knowledge makes us invincible.
And Paul shatters that false confidence in verse 12, right before he gets to the famous promise. He delivers a brutal, sobering warning.
Yeah, verse 12 is a direct assault on spiritual pride. Paul writes, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.
Take heed lest he fall.
The emphasis falls heavily upon self-deception. The person who is most confident in their own immunity is almost always the person least alert to imminent danger.
Right, because they aren't watching out for it.
Exactly. I mean, they aren't on guard at all. If the chosen national people of Israel fell into mass apostasy in the desert, despite their miraculous privileges, the proud Corinthians could certainly fall if they continued to compromise with temple feasts.
Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. That is a sharp pastoral edge.
Very sharp.
If my own willpower is useless, and
Right.
even participating in the life of the church does not guarantee I won't fail, I am left entirely exposed. Where is the actual safety net?
That is the big question.
Yeah, if human frailty is so pervasive, where does the Christian find security? And this brings us to the theological hinge of the entire passage. The text pivots sharply away from human weakness and points directly to divine character.
The transition from verse 12 to verse 13 is a masterful piece of writing.
How so?
Well, verse 13 begins with a brief 5-word clause in the Greek that serves as the logical anchor for everything else in the chapter. Pistos de Hoseos. But God is faithful.
But God is faithful.
Yeah.
Let's break down how Paul constructs that sentence, because the phrasing carries immense weight.
Sure. Before Paul describes any specific action God takes on our behalf, he forces the reader to confront the immutable character of God. The shift in the sentence serves as a sharp turning point.
Looking away from ourselves.
Right. Paul directs the gaze away from the human struggle, away from the frailty of the flesh, and focuses entirely on the covenant loyalty of the Creator. This echoes the Hebrew concept of Yahweh's covenant loyalty, his cheese.
His steadfast love.
Yeah, his steadfast love, which we see demonstrated time and again throughout the Old Testament narratives.
This establishes a massive theological distinction regarding where our final security actually lies.
It really does. Our final salvation and our ultimate preservation do not rely on mutable human willpower. They do not rely on a cooperative effort where God does his part and we must independently generate the strength to do our part.
Right, because we would just fail.
100%.
Yeah.
If our security depended even slightly on our own natural ability to resist temptation, we would all fall into ruin before the day was over. Instead, our preservation rests entirely on the objective, unyielding decrees of the Creator.
So it's all on him.
Yes. God is faithful to his own eternal decree, he is faithful to his promises, and he is faithful to the people he has called into fellowship with his Son. This is a monergistic security. God alone guarantees the outcome of our preservation.
I want to point out a huge contrast here for the listener. Think about what secular psychology tells a suffering person today.
Oh man, the difference is night and day.
It really is. The prevailing message of the modern world is to look within for strength. We are told to find our inner resilience, to speak our truth, to manifest our own destiny.
Just dig deeper.
Right. The culture tells you that the resources to overcome your trial are buried somewhere deep inside your own psyche. If you just dig deep enough, you will find the hero within. But Paul does the exact opposite.
Totally opposite.
Looking inward during a spiritual crisis is like looking at a broken compass. Paul directs the believer to look entirely outside themselves. He tells you to anchor your hope in the steady, objective character of God. The saint may tremble, the saint may feel completely exhausted and ready to quit, but the rock beneath their feet does not move.
That highlights the crucial distinction between biblical hope and secular optimism. Optimism hopes that circumstances will improve or that personal resilience will suffice. Biblical hope rests on the unchanging nature of God.
And he doesn't change.
No, he does not lie, he does not forget his promises, and he does not abandon his people. Every promise of limitation and provision that follows in this verse is structurally subordinate to and guaranteed by this single declarative statement: God is faithful.
Knowing God is faithful in theory is wonderful, but how does God's faithfulness practically operate when you are in the middle of a crushing trial?
That is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. What is he doing right now while the pressure is actively pressing down on you? This brings us to the concept of the sovereign veto. God actively governs the boundaries of our testing.
Paul continues by outlining the negative constraint of divine providence. He writes, "Who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able?"
Will not allow.
The phrasing here establishes a protective decree. God exercises active, sovereign veto authority over the forces of temptation. He stands over the trial and dictates its absolute limits.
Satan is on a leash.
That is a perfect way to say it. Satan is on a leash. We see this reality clearly illustrated in the book of Job. Satan is not an independent, free-roaming agent who can inflict unlimited suffering whenever he desires.
He has to ask for permission.
Yes, he must petition the heavenly court, and God sets an absolute boundary that Satan is forbidden to cross. God tells Satan he may touch Job's possessions, but he may not touch Job's body.
And later that changes, right?
Right. Later, God allows Job's body to be afflicted, but sets a strict boundary preserving Job's life. God regulates the pressure. He knows the exact frame of his creatures. He remembers that we are dust, and he sets an absolute ceiling over our afflictions.
An analogy comes to mind that illustrates this well. Think of God's providence like a master structural engineer who is stress testing a newly designed bridge.
Oh, I like this.
Yeah. So before the bridge is ever built, the engineer calculates the exact load capacity of every single steel beam, every cable, and every concrete pillar. When they run the stress test, they place massive, heavy weights on the structure to see how it performs.
To see if it holds up.
Right. But the engineer will absolutely refuse to add a single ounce of weight beyond the calculated breaking point. They know exactly what the materials can withstand, and they actively govern the test to ensure the bridge holds. God is that master engineer with our souls. He calculates the stress factors, and he refuses to add the final ounce that would break us.
That analogy captures the concept of the sovereign ceiling beautifully. However, we must clarify what Paul means by the phrase, "what you are able."
Okay, let's clarify that.
When Paul says God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, he is not celebrating natural human grit. The ability he refers to is not a stock of native moral strength that we possess apart from grace.
Right, because if it was just our natural strength being measured, our breaking point would be virtually zero. The bridge would collapse under the weight of a feather.
Spot on. Left to our natural flesh, we are utterly incapable of resisting sin. The ability Paul mentions refers to the spiritual capability of the regenerate person who is actively sustained, indwelt, and empowered by the Holy Spirit.
It's a supernatural ability.
Yes. God governs the test and simultaneously supplies the grace so that faithful endurance remains a real possibility. The boundary is set according to the measure of supernatural grace God has allocated for our support, not our physical or mental toughness.
So God limits the maximum weight of the trial. He sets the ceiling. But how do we actually survive the intense pressure that God does permit?
Because it still hurts.
Right. Even if the weight is limited by the engineer, it still feels incredibly heavy to the person bearing it. This leads us to the egress, the actual way of escape.
Following the negative constraint, Paul presents the positive provision of sovereign grace. He writes, "But with the temptation, he will also make the way of escape."
With the temptation.
Yes, the text notes that the trial and the escape route are delivered at the exact same moment.
The escape route is not an afterthought.
No, it is never an emergency backup plan that God throws together when he looks down and sees we are struggling. God's providence has already manufactured the exit before the trial ever arrives on your doorstep.
That is incredible.
And the noun Paul uses for way of escape is highly descriptive. The Greek word is ekbasis.
Let's dig into the imagery behind ekbasis because it changes how we view the escape.
In classical ancient military literature, ekbasis was used to describe a very specific geographic feature. It referred to a mountain pass, a defile, or a narrow egress through which an army that was trapped in a canyon ambush could escape to safety.
Like a secret path out of a valley.
Yeah, and it is accompanied in the text by the definite article, making it the specific escape path designed for that specific trial. God maps out the terrain of your suffering, and he cuts a specific path through the mountains just for you.
I have to interject here on how we interpret that in the modern day. Yeah. When listeners hear the phrase way of escape, we almost universally think of an eject button.
Oh yeah, get me out of here!
Right, we think of an escape hatch in a submarine or a sci-fi teleporter that just magically beams us out of the uncomfortable situation. We expect the trial to suddenly vanish, the boss to get fired, the bank account to fill up, or the sickness to disappear. But does the text actually promise physical removal from the hardship?
That is a very pervasive misconception. We desperately want the pressure to evaporate, but we must look at the purpose clause that concludes the verse to understand the true nature of this escape. Paul writes that you may be able to bear it.
To bear it.
The verb used here is hypophero. It literally means to carry a heavy load by placing one's shoulders beneath it and standing up under the weight. It is the classic ancient term for endurance under severe crushing pressure.
So the escape is not necessarily escaping the heavy weight itself. The weight stays on your shoulders.
Often, the weight remains entirely unchanged. The divine provision is frequently not removal from the trial, but the bestowing of supernatural stamina to carry the heavy weight to the finish line without collapsing into apostasy or sin. God may not change the painful circumstance. The chronic illness may persist for decades. The difficult marriage may remain strained. The hostile workplace may continue to be antagonistic.
But God provides the support.
Right. God provides the structural support, the grace, so that you can bear the load faithfully. The escape is from capitulation to sin, not necessarily from the existence of the pressure.
That reframes everything. The escape is the stamina to shoulder the load without sinning. But these promises, the limitation of the trial, the simultaneous provision of the mountain pass, the strength to bear the load, these are incredible guarantees. How are they legally secured for the believer?
What do you mean by legally secured?
Well, we have no inherent right to demand this kind of protection from a holy God, right? The promises have to be anchored somewhere, or rather, in someone.
Yes. If we isolate this verse from the whole counsel of Scripture, we risk turning it into a dry, exhausting moralism where we just grit our teeth.
Which never works.
No, it never works. The promises of 1 Corinthians 10:13 are valid for the believer exclusively through union with Jesus Christ. In Reformed theology, we always read the warnings and promises of the epistles through a Christocentric lens. Christ is the true and faithful Israelite.
Let's draw that contrast out for the listener, comparing Israel's failure with Christ's victory.
Yeah.
Israel failed miserably in the desert.
Historical Israel was called God's son. They passed through the waters of the Red Sea, they entered the wilderness, and they failed completely under testing. They gave in to idolatry, they worshipped a golden calf, and they grumbled against God's provision.
Just a total failure.
Total failure. But where Israel failed, Jesus Christ, the last Adam and our covenant representative, achieved perfect victory. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, we read that Jesus was driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. He fasted for 40 days and faced the intense, unmitigated assaults of Satan.
And he faced them directly without any buffers.
Our trials, as Paul noted earlier, are restricted to a human scale. God sets a ceiling for us. Christ faced the concentrated supernatural fury of Satan's direct solicitations.
That is a heavy contrast.
It is. He was tempted to turn stones into bread in a moment of physical starvation, tempting him toward unbelief. He was tempted to test God's presence by throwing himself off the pinnacle of the temple. He is tempted to turn toward false worship by bowing to the devil in exchange for the kingdoms of the world.
But he didn't yield.
Never. Christ answered every single assault by standing firmly upon the objective authority of the written word of God. He fulfilled the righteousness that his people lacked. When a believer resists temptation today, they do not fight for victory. They fight from the victory already secured by Christ.
And because Christ took on human nature, he is not a distant, unfeeling deity watching us struggle from a comfortable distance. He is the sympathetic high priest.
Right.
The book of Hebrews tells us he was tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin.
His sinlessness does not make him distant from our struggle. It actually means he experienced the absolute full force of temptation without ever seeking relief through surrender.
I want to share a striking observation on that exact point. Think about how the mechanics of temptation work. A person who gives in to temptation only feels its pressure up to their own personal breaking point. If you give in to a temptation after 5 minutes, you only know what 5 minutes of that pressure feels like. You surrender, you commit the sin, and the psychological tension breaks.
Right. The tension is gone once you give in.
Exactly. Precisely. Because Jesus never yielded. He never relieved the tension through sin. Therefore, he is the only human being to ever feel the absolute maximum force of temptation. He bore it completely to the end, absorbing the full weight of the assault.
That is a staggering thought.
When we run to him in our pain, we are running to someone who comprehends the pressure perfectly. He knows how heavy the load can get.
That insight captures the essence of Christ's mediatorial work perfectly. Christ felt the visceral reality of human testing. He felt the physical weakness of hunger, the emotional sorrow of betrayal, and the intense spiritual pressure of facing the enemy.
He felt all of it.
All of it. Therefore, tempted believers can approach the throne of grace with confidence to receive mercy and find timely help. The way of escape, the ekbasis, is not an abstract formula. It is not a psychological technique you practice in the mirror.
No.
In the deepest redemptive historical sense, Jesus Christ himself is the way of escape. Through our vital union with him, we are made partakers of his resurrection life. We draw spiritual nourishment from him, and the same power that raised him from the dead enables us to carry the heavy load of affliction.
So because Christ secured this massive victory, and because God is faithful to govern our trials and provide the mountain pass, how must your daily life change?
It has to change.
Right. The theological promise demands a highly practical, actionable response. We cannot just nod at this theology, appreciate the history, and stay exactly the same.
The doctrine of divine preservation must never be twisted into an excuse for spiritual passivity. The original Corinthian audience was expected to hear these words and immediately align their daily conduct with the truth.
How does Paul say that?
Paul makes this explicit in the very next verse, verse 14. He writes, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." The word therefore connects the theological promise of preservation directly to the urgent command for action.
The guarantee of God's support is not an excuse to sit around on the couch and wait for a miracle to zap you out of trouble. It is the engine that drives your active, strenuous obedience.
The promise that God makes the way of escape is the very reason we must actively run. The original readers were commanded to stop debating how close they could get to the pagan temples without technically sinning.
They were just playing with fire.
Yeah, they were ordered to leave the compromising setting entirely. They had to decline the cultic meals, walk away from the temple precincts, and accept the social and financial loss that inevitably followed.
Which was huge for them.
It was everything. But the reality of human responsibility operating under divine sovereignty means that our fight against sin is not a hopeless, agonizing exercise. It is an active walking in the escape path God has already built.
We have to dismantle a couple of modern errors here that directly contradict this call to active obedience.
Yeah.
The first is the prosperity gospel.
Oh, the prosperity gospel, yes.
What does that look like?
The prosperity gospel falsely claims that it is always God's will for the believer to experience a life completely free from physical suffering, financial hardship, and emotional distress. It views trials, sickness, and poverty as a lack of faith.
Which is just cruel to suffering people.
It is incredibly cruel.
Yeah.
But 1 Corinthians 10.13 stands as a monumental correction against that error. The text assumes the constant presence of severe temptation and testing. It does not promise a pampered life of carnal ease.
Right.
It promises the strength to bear up under the fire of sanctifying affliction. Trials are a normative, divinely appointed means of grace designed to conform us to the image of Christ.
The second error we need to reject is quietism. This is that popular let go and let God mentality.
Oh.
It is the idea that if you are striving against sin, if you are sweating and fighting, you are doing it wrong. The quietist says you should just passively let the Holy Spirit do all the work while you coast along.
Quietism paralyzes spiritual growth. God does not pick us up and carry us over the mountain pass while we remain asleep in his arms.
That's a great visual.
He gives us the spiritual legs, the clear vision, and the fortitude to walk through the pass ourselves. If we want to see the application of this text in our lives, we must take concrete, deliberate actions.
Let's get really practical for the listener. If God has built this mountain pass for us, how do we practically take it when we are exhausted and the pressure is at its peak? What are the actual boots-on-the-ground steps?
First, we must cease all faithless murmuring.
Stop complaining.
Yes, stop complaining. When we complain that our trial is too much to handle or that our situation is uniquely unfair, we are essentially calling the sovereign God a liar.
Wow, that is convicting.
We are denying his explicit promise to limit the trial to a human scale. True repentance requires silencing those faithless complaints and trusting his wisdom over our unstable, fluctuating feelings.
Okay, what is the second step?
Second, we must name the specific idol honestly. Sin grows rapidly in the fog of vague confessions. We must ask ourselves what specific promise the sin is making to us and what rival lord is demanding our loyalty.
We have to get specific. Saying, I struggle with purity or I struggle with anger is too vague. You have to name the actual action, the specific website, or the specific bitter attitude you are harboring.
Naming the sin strips away its camouflage. Third, we must reject secrecy. The claim that our temptation is unique thrives in the dark isolation of our own minds.
We think we are all alone.
Right. We must confess our struggles to trusted members of the church community. Others have endured similar fires by grace, and God uses their counsel, their prayers, and their accountability as an instrument of preservation.
And what is the final step?
And finally, we must utilize the ordinary means of grace.
The ordinary means of grace. Let's list those out so there's no confusion about what we mean.
Sure. These are the channels through which God ordinarily communicates his preserving power to his people. The diligent reading and preaching of Scripture, earnest prayer, participation in the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and the fellowship of the local church.
These aren't flashy things.
No, they aren't flashy at all. Many believers neglect these ordinary means while waiting for subjective mystical signs or private revelations to guide them out of trouble.
They want a writing in the sky.
Yeah, but the Spirit of God sanctifies through the word he inspired. Neglecting the public reading of the word and private prayer while asking God for strength is like refusing to eat a meal while praying for physical nourishment.
That makes total sense.
The path of escape will never, ever contradict the written word of God.
We have covered massive ground today. We started by looking at the myth of the unique trial, stripping away the lie that your struggle is somehow a cosmic anomaly that justifies compromise. We looked at the historical reality of Corinth, where believers face severe social and economic ruin if they refuse to participate in pagan temple feasts. We analyzed the internal arrogance of the Corinthian elite who thought their sacraments acted as a magic shield.
We covered a lot.
We did. We heard Paul's stark warning drawn from the wilderness generation. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.
We then explored the objective faithfulness of God as the true anchor of our preservation. We saw that God exercises a sovereign veto, setting an absolute ceiling over the intensity of our trials.
Master engineer.
Yes. We defined the way of escape not as an escapist removal from our circumstances, but as the simultaneous provision of supernatural stamina to carry the heavy load without sinning.
Right.
We grounded all of this in the perfect victory of Jesus Christ, our sympathetic high priest who bore the maximum weight of temptation. And finally, we traced how these huge theological realities demand active obedience, the rejection of false gospels, and a reliance on the ordinary means of grace.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. It is a paradigm-shifting idea that challenges everything our culture tells us about success, relief, and suffering.
Let's hear it.
What if your ultimate victory is not escaping the hardship? What if the goal is not to have the heavy weight removed from your shoulders?
Mm.
What if the true victory is the stamina to stand under that crushing weight, feeling every ounce of its pressure and yet refusing to sin? What if bearing the load faithfully, day after day, without yielding to the idol, is the exact triumph God ordained for his glory in your life right now?
That is a staggering thought. It completely reorients our definition of deliverance. Deliverance is not always the absence of pain. It is the presence of holiness in the midst of the pain.
We opened this deep dive talking about diagnostic muddy waters and the cliche that God won't give you more than you can handle. We can confidently throw that cliche away.
Straight in the trash.
Right. The truth is much heavier, but it's infinitely more secure. Your trials are measured. The mountain pass has been built. The high priest has walked the road before you. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. Rest securely in the unyielding decrees of your faithful Creator.